Hi, I'm Anthony, here with SUNY Brockport. With me today is Stu Krieger, Brockport alum. He wrote the screenplay for legendary films such as The Land Before Time, and then notable Disney films including Zenon Girl of the 21st Century and Smart House. He's also the author of the recently published novel Raft. How are you today, Stu?
I'm terrific.
So, The Land Before Time has been referred to as a timeless classic by a lot of people. What do you think are key elements of the film that really stick with both children and adults today?
I think one of the things that's really been rewarding for me since it is now existed since 1988 is the fact that the underlying themes of family and friendship and disparate characters learning how to get along still resonate to multiple generations. And the most gratifying things currently is I now have former students who are sending me pictures of them watching it with their children.
Oh, that's great.
And the fact that I think this means we're on a third generation that's still responding and still finding the same things relevant that were when we made it.
It's like one of those films that, like, when you watch it as a kid, you'll never forget it. Yeah. Like, it will stick with you, the themes throughout it. And it's amazing to hear that people are still watching it nowadays with their kids growing up. I was surprised to hear that one of Steven Spielberg's initial visions for the film was to have no dialogue at all.
Yeah.
And then I heard that you were a kind of a proponent for pushing for dialogue. Can you talk a little bit about how that process developed and how you were able to sway like a legend such as Steven Spielberg to kind of come over to your side on that?
Yeah, one of the things that I've said many times, because it's something people always ask me about, is I worked on 4 projects with Steven, and he was one of the most decent, grounded, just very approachable guys in the industry in a way that you wouldn't imagine given the weight and reputation. So he was always very open to the best idea in the room. It wasn't, it has to be my way or the highway. And the original conceit for him was he was thinking about that sequence in Fantasia and kind of the majesticness of it and the grandeur of dinosaurs and all the rest of it. But then as the story started to develop, it was knowing who our target audience is, knowing some of the themes we wanted to explore, like I said, about different cultures, finding each other in a way to get along. We were really talking about, especially for the target audience of young kids, you could do everything you can with pantomime and they're not going to latch on the same way. And, you know, often when they talk about the classic animated films, it's the voices of the characters that really capture them. And now, you know, all these years later, I will constantly have people come up to me, Land Before Time, yup, yup, yup. And they do their Ducky impersonation or whatever it is. And I think for kids to be able to latch on to personality and, like I said, the different nature of the different characters, we really needed the dialogue to capture their attention and be able to make sure those themes came through. And so as we were developing the story and talking it through, it just made more and more sense. But then when the movie was about to come out, I wrote an article for the Hollywood Reporter magazine that they had asked me to write. And the title of it was A Dinosaur Wouldn't Say That. And some of my favorite days working on the movie was George Lucas was often up at Lucas Ranch. And so he would be I don't know if this translates generationally, but the reference I always made was he was like Charlie from Charlie's Angels, because there was a box in the middle of the table and George would just hear his voice coming out of it. But I never met him in person until the premiere of the movie, because he was always up at Lucas Ranch. But we'd have these debates about, okay, if they're looking at the leaves, what would the leaves be? And I am very proudly the guy who came up with Tree Star. And doing that, I think there's a video on social media that we did alluding to this, but I was laying in the backyard looking up at the trees and going, oh, from down here, they kind of look like stars, tree stars. But then we'd be at the table and arguing different terms. And at one point, somebody, I forget, because it was Don Bluth, the director, was at the table, and Frank Marshall and Kathy Kennedy, who are the producers, and George on the Squawk Box and Steven at the table. And somebody said, no, a dinosaur wouldn't say that. And it's like, you guys, a dinosaur wouldn't say anything. So, so that was kind of the constant furious debate.
Yeah.
But we
decent argument, but if we live in that realm, we're never going to write the film.
Yeah,
so.
Exactly. So that was kind of how the dinosaurs came to speak.
Yep. So kind of talking a little bit, leaning into George Lucas and Spielberg, how Lucas had that kind of call-in role with the film. Do you have any notable moments or memories when you were writing any of the projects that you've been with Spielberg or The Land Before Time that kind of stick out to you? We talked a little bit about just the dialogue, but anything else that kind of sticks out on that process?
Yeah, I learned very early on, and this changed my kind of take on it, is I think somehow when Steven married Kate Capshaw, who was his second wife, she made him more emotionally accessible than he had previously been. But
sorry, did you know him before that marriage as well?
When, the first thing I did with him was Amazing Stories, which was his first foray into television. And he was married to the actress Amy Irving at the time. And what I learned very quickly was you couldn't talk about real life to make a point. You had to make a movie analogy. And so you would say to him, it's like Saturday night when you're out with your wife and this happens. He goes, oh, it's like that scene from Roman Holiday. And as soon as you would, no, it's like when you're talking to your wife. No. And so he really related and spoke in movie metaphors. And that was part of the learning curve of being able to work successfully with him. Think about what it is you want to say, and then what's the
closest movie where I can make that analogy? This exact scene that will fit this.
Yeah, and then like I said, he matured and his relationships matured, and the films like Schindler's List and some of the stuff that had more emotional depth than the earlier films, I really felt like evolved as he evolved.
Did you work with Spielberg at all after The Land Before Time, or was that the last film you guys worked on together?
No, when DreamWorks was formed, they had the rights to the Goosebump games to do interactive versions of it. And this was back in the days of CD-ROM.
Yeah, with the computer. And
exactly. And so I did 2 of those for him, and it was the first 2 Goosebumps CD-ROM games. And the thing that was so interesting, that was in the day where you had to, the script was like 180 pages because it had, if you make this choice, you go down that path, and then
choose your own adventure kind of thing.
Yeah, exactly. And so it was really an interesting exercise in writing because you had to figure out ways that eventually everything dovetailed back to the same place, but there was 8 or 9 ways to get there.
It's funny, Spielberg must have had because I didn't know he did the Goosebumps games, but he must have had a little foray into CD-ROM games for a while, because I know he had a game where it was like you were a director and you like did your own film for a while, and the whole game was being in the director's chair and like splicing up and editing film together. And that's just interesting to hear that he did other games as well, because I was like, oh, that's a cool concept for a game, back in the early 90s and stuff like that. But it's cool to hear he did a kind of foray into video games.
I'm pretty sure that the Goosebumps games were first, because they were one of the first 2 projects at DreamWorks. And just a sidebar note that was so funny. I got a DreamWorks hat before anybody even knew what DreamWorks were, and it was a baseball cap.
Yeah.
But I went to Disneyland wearing the DreamWorks hat, and we were on Splash Mountain, and it went flying off my head. And I said, I'm sure that somebody at Disney's got the suction. Like, you're not wearing a DreamWorks hat here at Disneyland, because the hat it was gone. And I had to go back to them and, you guys, could I have another hat?
For aspiring screenwriters and writers in general that might be trying to get into Hollywood or film productions, do you have any advice for young college students possibly going into the field, and things they can do to kind of make them stand out? Yeah.
First of all, if you're a writer, write. One of the things that gets very frustrating for me as a college professor now, I've been teaching at the UC Riverside for the last 16 years, is people that come into my office and go, I want to be a writer and I'm thinking about this, I'm thinking about that. Do you have any advice? And I said, what are you working on right now? Well, I got some ideas. Well, if you got ideas, you're an idea guy. If you're a writer, you write.
Yep.
And one of the great gifts that I always felt for pursuing that path myself was, directors need a crew, they need actors, they need a set, they need space to do what they do. Actors need a script, they need things writers can write. And so I get very frustrated with, well, I'm thinking about this and someday I'm going to, someday is now, and get up every day. And if you decide, I write an hour in the morning, I write an hour before I go to bed, I write something. And one of the things that's come up many times, both in class and in interviews, is people will say to me, how did you deal with the writer's block? And I always say, and it sounds flippant, but there's an underlying truth. I say, I didn't have writer's block, I had a mortgage. And that was how I supported
it. Overpowers the writer's block. You're like, I'm just going to sit down and write something because the mortgage has to get paid.
Yeah, and what you just said is so important, because the argument that I'll make back to students is, if you write something, there's something to make better.
Yep, exactly.
And if you get yourself into the mode of everything has to be perfect right out of the gate, everything is, my first draft is going to be brilliant. It's not. But if you're writing something, then there's something to improve, something to work on, something to figure out what's working and not working. So first and foremost, write. And then ultimately, if you want to get into the business, it's a business of contacts and relationships. And last week on this tour, we were at the Long Island Film School talking to students there, and they were asking similar questions. And one of them said, do I have to be in Los Angeles to start a career? And I said, honestly, in the beginning, you do. If you're lucky enough to get to a certain level of success, then you can live elsewhere and come in for meetings. But because it's so much about meeting people, getting your
Networking.
name in front of people, networking, all of that is so important that you got to be in the place where you can meet the people that can help you have the career you want to have.
So can we look back about at your time a little bit? So if you went to college here at SUNY Brockport, how did you know you always wanted to go into Hollywood kind of film writing? And then how did you make that leap? Did you end up moving out to LA, or was it a little bit different back then?
No, I did a TED Talk in 2017, I think. And at the beginning of that, I said to that question that I was a bit of a freak because I had absolutely no connection to the entertainment industry. But starting in second grade, it was like, I'm going to go to Hollywood and make movies. At first, I had a big red afro when I was a little kid. And first, I thought I wanted to be an actor. And then I actually did get to act in a film that I wrote and saw my face on the big screen and said, no, wrong choice. But always wanted to write, and about fifth and sixth grade started writing, and I had an early high school angst-ridden coming of age thing that I wrote that I found in a drawer fairly recently, and it's just awful, but I was writing. So my family made a pilgrimage to LA when I was 12, and at the end of the 2 weeks there, I said to my parents, so this place exists, and you guys are going back to Rochester, huh? And they said, yep. And I said, just so you know, as soon as I'm old enough to make my own decisions, I will be back here. This is where I belong. And it was kind of weird because it really was what it felt like. This is where I'm supposed to be. And so I graduated from here. I worked at the Arby's on Monroe Avenue for the summer and packed up and moved to LA.
Okay, well, that's actually going to transition to one of the other questions I wanted to ask. You do often write about Monroe County or Rochester as settings, but it's interesting you had a calling and a pull to LA. Can you talk about why you maybe write in some of those upstate New York settings sometimes for some of your films like Smart House, and I believe Raft is in? The guy moved to LA, kind of like you, right?
I think it's one of the things you've always heard Ted said to writers about write what you know. But it's been really interesting having Paul, my assistant, with me on this trip because he'd never been to New York at all. And we were in the city, and then we've been in upstate for the last 4 or 5 days. And one of the things I've said to him is it was a fantastic place to grow up. And so much of kind of the same way Spielberg has idealized the suburbs and all the rest of it, it was an incredibly safe and carefree, and all of my friends, and 6 of whom I'm still close enough touch, and these are guys I've known since elementary school. We do a weekly Zoom, and they're all over the world, and we have this sacrosanct whoever's around today and can do it. So sometimes it's awesome. 6, sometimes it's 2, whatever, but it's been going on since COVID started. And so that sense of community, that sense of family, that sense of a neighborhood where we could jump on our bikes and go to each other's houses and be gone for the whole day. And all of that is something I know and love and like to bring to my work.
I watched Smart House a couple of days ago. I saw it growing up as well. And when he was filling out the application online, he put in Monroe County. I was like, it's in Monroe County. It's in Monroe County. When writing Zenon Girl of the 21st Century and Smart House, I heard you went to the NASA Propulsion Laboratory. I think I got that correctly.
No, it's actually the Jet Propulsion Laboratory.
Jet Propulsion Laboratory.
In Pasadena.
Can you talk a little bit about that experience and how it impacted the 2 films as they deal with technological advancements?
Yeah, it's been very funny, especially since the advent of social media and the internet and everything. I've probably done 6 or 7 podcasts and 10 or 12 magazine interviews because people will reach out and they can find me through the UCR website and they'll say, I work for this tech magazine, and dude, you invented the iPad. Or, Pat in Smart House was basically Alexa, and how did you do that? Like
we were talking about that before you came in too.
And I said it's 2 things. One, when you're assigned something set in the future, it's kind of extrapolating where are we and logically where are we going to go, watching the progression that came before, what's going to come ahead. But then at JPL, those guys were so great because it was just like walk me around and talk me through some of the things you're working on and some of the things that you see. And particularly they were the Zap pads in Zenon, which are basically iPads. I said, when I was a kid, computers took up a whole room, and then they evolved into desktops that became laptops. And so it's like, okay, well, the next thing's going to be something totally portable that, and that's where the Zap pad came from. So I've said in many of these interviews, I don't think I'm any great genius or prognosticator or anything else. It was just sort of looking where we were and seeing where we'd go. But doing research like that and when the thing I said earlier about write what you know, that only means for me, the most like underlying emotional truth, but I was never a 12-year-old girl living on the space station, but I have kids and I have a son and a daughter, and I pay attention to them and I listen to them, and I do due diligence with research about whatever the environment is, and put those two things together, and you get Smart House and Zenon.
Writing such landmark films geared towards children, how does having kids impact that? Do you think it is even possible to really write something like that for children without having that kind of connection and aspect that you had as a father?
No. One of the really interesting things was I was working on Amazing Stories with Stephen, as I mentioned, and his head of development came to me and she said, Stephen and I were having a conversation the other night, and we both feel like you've become an even better writer since you've become a dad. And Stephen and George had this idea for an animated dinosaur movie they want to do. Do you want to write it for them? And I say this to my students all the time. When you get asked that question, you say yes. You don't ask a whole lot of other questions. You don't ask how much you're going to get paid. You say yes. So that was the first validation of, taking what I was learning as a dad into my work. But then also I feel like I'm somebody who is still very much in touch with my own childhood, and I am an old child. So I think that helps a lot. But then the really concrete answer to your question was, my office at home is at the front of the house. It's got acoustic glass doors like a recording studio. So when the doors are closed, I can't hear what's going on. And my kids were trained from a very early age. They called it the box. If daddy's in the box, you leave him alone until the door's back open again. But literally, because my wife was a stay-at-home mom when they were growing up, that was the house in the neighborhood where all the kids came after school, and they were always playing and running around the backyard. And I would look out the window. My son had my fedora and a leather jacket on, and he was Indiana Jones, and all that was going on all the time. And I tell the story when I was working on Smart House with all the Disney movies. I would open the door, I would listen to them for 10 or 15 minutes. I'd close the door and go, okay, there's the next
Just
scene.
write it down. There you go.
And Disney used to send me dailies of the footage they shot the day before all the time, and I'd get the little CDs delivered to the house. DVDs delivered to the house and sit down. And my son, who now is a filmmaker, was always very interested. He'd sit with me and watch dailies.
Oh, that's awesome.
And there's the scene in Smart House where Katie's bouncing on the bed and Ryan Merriman's character, Ben, says, you're so annoying. You're annoying, Spice. And they have that interaction and yelling at each other. And my son, Gus, is watching the dailies with me. And he goes, Dad, Rosie and I had that exact fight a month ago. And I go, I know, dude. And that's why you're going to be able to go to college, because, I'm stealing from you to be able to make a living that someday is going to ricochet back to you.
Oh, that's awesome. Yeah. You were talking about how you had dailies sent to you. How does actually the process of writing for film and screenplays, how does that work? Are you on set ever, or is it normally like a lot of your work done ahead of time before they start filming? What does that process look like for a writer of film?
Yeah. So it's easy to kind of use the canon of, ultimately I did 12 movies for the Disney Channel, and each one of them was a little bit different. In terms of Zenon was based on a just very thin kids picture book. And they said, come on and pitch us your take of how you would adapt this. And I pitched a take they liked and got hired. And I think they said I was like the 19th writer that came in, and I was the one who really got what the movie should be. And then out of that, the relationship started growing. And then one of the movies I did, Phantom of the Megaplex, came about because the head of development at Disney Channel called me and said, I got this great title, but I don't know what the movie is. Take the title and come back and pitch me what the story might be. And so that was one I was involved from the ground up, all 3 Zenon movies ground up. And then there were projects like Smart House that were already in development at the studio. They had bought the concept. In Smart House's case, there was an underlying book that it was based on. There was a writer that preceded me who did a draft that they said, when they called me in, they said, the basic bones of the script are here. We like a lot of the technology stuff in it, but we don't feel like the heart is here. And that's what you do so well. So come back to us of pitching how you would add a little bit more, just heart and depth and character development to it. And so that's how that one evolved. So each one was a little bit different, but the scripts are very, very, very much done before any production begins. At Disney Channel in particular, it was a great place to work because they were on such a tight deadline. They didn't have a lot of time to mess with the scripts. And I'm sure you've seen interviews with other writers where they talk about, they totally mangled my script. And by the time the film was done, I didn't even recognize it. And most of the films I did for Disney Channel are pretty much what's on the screen was what was on the page.
Awesome.
And then the thing that I was able to do on most of them was I would be on set they always did a table read, which is the first time all the actors are together reading the script from beginning to end. And then they do a couple days of rehearsal and then shooting. And so usually I was there for table read rehearsals, first couple of days of shooting, and then it would be, you guys good? I'm good. See you later. Peace out. I'd go home, and then often things would happen like, I remember it was on the Proof Point, I think, where a location they were supposed to shoot at fell out, and I got a call late afternoon. The scene we're shooting tomorrow was set in a bowling alley, but we don't have the bowling alley. Can you move it to a diner? So it was just, overnight.
Work on the fly and change the scene.
And, I'm a dinosaur enough that it was like stick it in the fax machine, and we'll have the pages and we'll stick them in the script. So there was a lot of that. And so I was involved all the way through, but most often not on set, except for the first week or so. And as a writer, it's really, if you don't have another role, it's really uncomfortable to be on set because you're just in the way.
Yeah.
Everybody's moving lights, they're moving cables, and no matter what you're doing, you're in the way. And I was never a fan of that. Actually, when I visited Proof Point, a friend of mine was directing, and I was doing everything I could to stay out of the way and be hiding. And I was in the corner sitting up on a table with my legs crossed. And he came over and he said, "You hate being here, don't you?" And I go, "Why? I'm minding my own business." And he goes, "I'm just looking at your face, and you would rather be anywhere else." And I went, "Yeah, you're kind of right."
So The Land Before Time deals with dinosaurs from prehistoric time. And then you have films like Zenon that deal with kind of teenagers and from a not so distant, it was 2049, I believe, but technologically advanced future. How do you write for such drastically different settings, but still keep a core cast of characters that children and people can latch onto and resonate with?
Yeah, I was just saying the other day at the Long Island Film School that I'm always a character-based writer. So my jumping off point is never plot. It's always, who are my core characters? And then the three primary questions.
Setting.
Who are they? What do they want? What's in the way of what they want? And so for me, once I start to know that, I start to develop that, and then the relationships, building an ensemble is always, okay, if this is my core character, who are the supporting players I need to put around them so that they can help either be the obstacle or fomenting the change that needs to happen. And then the rest of it is what we were talking about earlier, really researching then what's the environment. And so if it's prehistoric or futuristic, if the emotional underpinning's not working, and if you're not relating to the characters and you're not caring about their struggle, you don't care. And so that's one of the things I'm always saying to my students. Interesting premise, I don't care. Make me care. Show me something that one of your characters is going through that I can latch on to, relate to, care about. If you have the most fantastic setting in the world and you're not making me care, I'm not going to like your movie.
So you've recently published a novel, Raft, as we talked about earlier. Can you talk about that foray into writing novels and how that's different from your past and your kind of transition as a writer?
Yeah. How that happened was when I got the full-time job at UC Riverside, I was really at a point in my career where everything you've ever heard about, are you being aged out in terms of, new kids flavor of the month. Some of that was happening. Some of the times I was going out for interviews for jobs I didn't want to get. I would be sitting in the interview going, I don't want to write this movie. That was kind of happening. I was very much enjoying teaching. I had been doing one class a year at USC that kind of led to the Riverside job. And so I was very, very fortunate that I was one of the guys that was able to kind of make this elegant segue to the next chapter of my life, as opposed to waiting to be pushed out of the business. And when I first started at Riverside, I was the head writer and story editor on an animated show for Nickelodeon called Toot and Puddle.
Oh, cool.
And being the head writer and story editor meant we did 26 episodes. I wrote 9 of them. I had to rewrite all the rest of them just as head writer to kind of take the scripts and make sure the voices are consistent and it all feels the same. And I woke up one day and I was working 90 hours a week. And it was like, that's not really what I want to be doing right now. And then right at the end of that gig, my agent called and he said, I'm making a segue into producing, but there's other agents here I can introduce you to. And I said, you know what? I'm good. I feel like, it's time to close the door on that chapter. I'm very proud of the things I've been able to do and the resume I have. I'm really happy teaching. And at the time I said to him, but I'm a writer, I will always write. And the first thing I did was I wrote a play. And in part because we are in a theater department at Riverside, it's theater, film, and digital production. And they were always looking for original work for our students to be able to do, with the idea that then if the playwright's there, they can actually work with them and talk with them. So I wrote a play, and then I started work on the first novel, which was That One Cigarette that came out in 2017. And that was a project that needed a lot of research because, like I said, it was counterfactual from 1963 to 2008. When I was hired, part of my hiring package was I had money to hire grad students to be research assistants for me.
There you go.
So that whole summer, I had 2 guys working for me where I would just say, tell me who the Bills were playing on this day in 1963, and tell me a battle in Vietnam where this and this and this happened. And they would come back with reams of stuff for me. But that was just much more a friendly schedule to the academic life because I could write when I could write. I did a lot of the work during the summer when I wasn't teaching. And then at one point, I, against my will, became department chair for 3.5 years and kind of had to put the book down. It was
that's a lot of work to take on.
So I was teaching and department chair. But I was perfectly comfortable to say, I'm close to a first draft done. The time away will give me some objectivity. I said at the book event we did Friday night in Rochester that the first draft of that, because it was so liberating that finally I could write as long as I wanted to write. Disney Channel movies are 90 pages and very specific structure. And so when I went back to look at the first draft, it was 529 pages long. And I ended up cutting almost 200 pages out of it because that freedom was just, and then this character wanders down this path, and then this. And then when I went back to it, it was like, but what's that got to do with the plot? Stay on point, dude. And so, I had to cut a bunch of it out. And then that, like I said, was 2017, took a little minute off, and then got the idea for Raft that was based on something I had tried to do years before as a screenplay. And kind of the midlife crisis the character's going through. When I made the first attempt, I was in the middle of that, and I just didn't have the clarity and the objectivity to really write about it. So I put that away. And when I came back to it, it was with 20 years hindsight and diaries that I had written at the time that I could go back and read. And it was much more kind of fresh and tangible and able to draw on all of that. But once again, it was 2 years of the writing process and then another year once I got the publisher of working with their editor and getting it ready for prime time.
Well, I'm glad you mentioned that about Raft because that was one of the questions I wanted to ask. It started as a screenplay years ago, you had mentioned. How can you, and maybe you didn't have this clarity at the time, but how do you look at a piece of work and know, okay, maybe this isn't working as a screenplay, it could work in another medium, for example, Raft with novels. As someone who does write and for aspiring writers out there, is it possible to look at something and just say, hey, maybe this isn't the right medium for this story?
Yeah, and I think a lot of that comes with maturity and experience. And so one of the other things that I feel really fortunate about as a writer is each life experience, each crisis, each joy experience you go through brings new stuff to what you're able to write about with authenticity. And so one of the things in terms of learning how to have clarity about your own work is being perfectly comfortable to say, okay, now I need to put this down for a minute. I will revisit it at some point. It's another beautiful thing about being writers that there's no sell-by date. It doesn't go bad in the refrigerator. And I was telling somebody recently that there was a project I did. It was a spec script that went out to the town and it was picked up by Hollywood Pictures, which was a division of Disney. It was under option for a year. They ended up not making it. And then the expression, if you heard a project in turnaround, means it goes back to the writer after a certain period that's in your contract. So I got the script back. And it was 6 or 7 years later, an executive that had been in that meeting at Disney called me and she said, I'm now working at ABC Family. They're looking for a project like how I remember your script. Do you have the rights to it again? And I said, yeah. She said, send it over. Let me take a look at it. And ABC Family made the movie. And that's kind of an inspirational thing to students because I'll say that was an 8-year-old script at that point. And somebody remembered it and somebody wanted it and the movie got made. And so similarly with the novel, making that transition and making that decision that maybe it's something else. What happened with Raft was I just put it away. I just know it's not working. And I wasn't thinking about at the time, is it better in another medium? And then a little more than 3 years ago, I was swimming in my backyard and picked my head up to take a breath and went, wait, I know what that is. And part of the reason that I think it works really well as a novel is it's about a family of 4 with a husband, wife, son, and daughter. And I was able to use each character's point of view. So each chapter is narrated by a different character. And what that did for me is it's so much about a family at the beginning that's, kind of growing apart because of all the life pressures and things that are happening, and the son's leaving for college and the dad's having his own crisis. But getting each character to narrate gave me a perspective and a point of view that was one of the points I wanted to make with the book of, to be a harmonious family, you have to be able to see and recognize and honor everybody's point of view and give it equal weight. And that's what really gave me that perspective that told the story the way I wanted to tell it.
And maybe you didn't have that chance back when you were writing it as a screenplay back then. As you said, you were still going through kind of the midlife crisis, and then you didn't have the lens of writing from other kind of views that you can do in a novel. So that's really interesting. Adaptations can be very tricky. When you wrote a screenplay, I believe, for Freaky Friday, which at that point in time was a book and already a movie. How do you write an adaptation and make it distinct enough to be your own work almost, but you're still honoring and remembering the work that came before it?
Yeah, great question. So there have now been 3 Freaky Friday versions. I'm hearing there's another one in the works.
Yes, when I was searching her, I was like, wow, this is going to be the 4th one.
Yeah. And so for me, one thing that I did with that project in particular was I went back and watched the original film, which was Jodie Foster was the kid in, because it was like exactly what you said. I would need to understand the underpinning of it, why it was a popular film at the time, what it is people related to and cared about, and then not wanting to duplicate, because what I was doing was not a remake in the sense of, some of the films that they remade, it's shot for shot, line for line what the original film was. And I didn't have any interest in doing that. So the idea for me was take that basic premise, take that basic relationship. A lot of it was contemporizing it, updating it in terms of just morals and values and parent-child relationships, how they'd evolved since this. I think that movie was mid-60s.
Yeah, mid-60s. Yours was mid-80s or late 80s? Or
where were we?
Maybe it was
early 80s. I think it was like 81 or 82. So it was some of that. And then it was just reinventing the characters to make them my own with, what I always do, like I said, drawing from my own life and some of the issues my kids were dealing with. And what are some of the things now that contemporary school kids are dealing with that weren't issues in the 60s and all of that. And so it's taking the core premise and honoring that and then creating a new story, springboarding from there.
So if a studio wanted to take Raft and turn it into a screenplay, a film, I have 2 questions. Would you move back into screenplay and write your own? And would you be interested in that project? And would you let someone else actually take your work and adapt it?
My fantasy version of the answer to that question is, as I mentioned earlier, my son Gus is a filmmaker. So I would love to do it together. That would be my first line of negotiation would be, if you want the film rights, you have to hire Gus and I to write the script together. It feels to me, because it is a multi-generational story, that actually could be a selling point of, the father and son who this is based on are going to write the screenplay together. I would love to do that. I think he's a really, really talented writer. I am a fan of his, even if I wasn't his dad. And I think it would be really fun to do the project together. And one of the nice things about being at this point in my life and career is I don't need it to be a film. And so I feel like that gives me leverage in any kind of negotiation if you're willing to do it this way, if you're willing to do it with this kind of time frame. So, when novels get first option is the first thing that happens in a studio or a production company pays you for the rights to the book for a certain finite amount of time. And options can be anywhere from 6 months to 2 years. And I think I would have a fairly tight window because that puts pressure on them. Are you making the movie or not? And then say, tight option, Gus and I writing it, you in or you out. And if that were to come together, cool. If not, I'm good.
So thanks for sitting down with me today, Stu. I really appreciate it. Is there anything at all that you want to plug or talk about before we let you go?
Sure. First of all, it's been an absolute pleasure, and I really appreciate the work you've done to have such intelligent and thoughtful questions. I would love you guys to pick up a copy of Raft. It's available on Amazon, Barnes & Noble, and directly from the publisher, Warren Publishing. You can check out the reviews on Amazon. People seem to be enjoying it. Multiple comments have said, I laughed on every page and cried at the end. And if that's the case, I did my job.
Exactly. So, there you go.
Thanks so much.
Awesome. Thank you, Stu.